On the 22nd of August 1553, one of the most powerful men in England was led to the execution scaffold on Tower Hill. He was there to meet the axeman and executioner, who was there to take his head clean off with the axe. John Dudley was the first Duke of Northumberland, and following the downfall of Edward Seymour, the Lord Protector, John Dudley emerged as the de facto regent and ruler for England during the reign of King Henry VIII's young son, Edward VI. Dudley was a very powerful man, and he oversaw a turbulent time in England as, following the death of young Edward VI, there was a dispute for the throne, as Dudley's daughter-in-law, Lady Jane Grey, was made queen. Dudley was a master manipulator, and someone who positioned himself as the main power behind the throne. But when Mary I, or Bloody Mary, came onto the throne following Jane's 9 days as queen, she dealt with Dudley ruthlessly. But after his execution, the body of Dudley was laid to rest inside the Tower of London's small chapel, but it was then dug up and was exhumed. John Dudley was a powerful politician and a soldier, who, as mentioned, practically ruled England between the years 1549 and 1554. It had been agreed that he was a schemer and a plotter who was obsessed with power, and he wanted more and more influence and power over the crown. Dudley's father was a man who was executed by King Henry VIII, and John Dudley became the deputy governor of the English port of Calais, and he was a skilled soldier and military leader in France, and was later appointed the Lord High Admiral. He was then part of Edward Seymour's invasion of Scotland, which rampaged north of the border, and he was also then made the Earl of Warwick in 1546. However, following the death of King Henry VIII, Warwick was appointed to become a member of the Regency Council that would help govern and rule England during the youth of Edward VI. The council was to rule whilst the king was too young to do so, and whilst he was a child, the man who was in charge of this was Edward Seymour. He ruled as the protector, and to begin with, he and Dudley worked together, and John Dudley's skilled military leadership was responsible for much of Edward Seymour's victories in Scotland. However, there was a lot of unrest in England during this time, and the Earl of Warwick, Dudley, took advantage of this, and he planned then to depose Seymour, and he managed to imprison him. The pair did briefly reconcile. However, John Dudley, the Earl of Warwick, then began the head of the government, and he was now the de facto ruler of England whilst Edward VI was young. He managed to replace Seymour as the leader of the government and made a number of changes. He left Scotland, reversed a lot of what Seymour had done, and continued to consolidate the Protestant Reformation, and also seized a lot of wealth from the church. However, to give him more power, John Dudley then made himself Duke of Northumberland, and then arrested Seymour again and persuaded the king, Edward VI, to sanction his execution. With Seymour out of the way, he continued to bring in a number of policies, and some of these were positive, as he tried to legitimise coinage and also tried to fight inflation across the nation. But when Edward VI died from tuberculosis at the age of 15, John Dudley carried out his plan. He had worked on the young king who had named Lady Jane Grey his successor, and as a matter of fact, Jane was actually Dudley's daughter-in-law, as she was married to Guildford, John's son. Lady Jane Grey is remembered as the 9-day queen, for the fact she ruled for 9 days and accepted the crown before she was deposed by Mary I, the eldest child of King Henry VIII. It was John Dudley who proclaimed Jane the Queen of England, but the Privy Council switched their support to Mary, and with this, Jane was imprisoned inside the Tower of London. Dudley also found himself locked up inside the Tower, accused of treason, and he was tried on the 18th of August 1553 inside of Westminster Hall. His former colleagues acted as the judge and jury, and Dudley believed he had acted in the best interests of the king, and by the warrant of the Great Seal, but he was found guilty of treason, and was then sentenced to death. He tried to appeal to Queen Mary I to overturn his death sentence, as he had 5 sons, but she would not relent. He was left to rot inside the Tower of London, and was visited by senior government officials, and his execution was then planned for the 21st of August 1553 at 8 o'clock in the morning. but it was then cancelled. With this, Dudley was then taken to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, inside the tower's walls, and he took Catholic communion, and he said that the leagues that is upon the realm and upon us now is that we have erred from the faith these 16 years. But that evening, Dudley learnt that he must prepare myself against tomorrow to receive my deadly stroke, and he wrote, "O my good Lord, remember how sweet life is, and how bitter ye contrary." On the 22nd of August 1553, John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, was brought to Tower Hill for his execution. A crowd of 10,000 people had gathered to witness the proceedings, and on the scaffold it was said Dudley confessed to his crimes. It was said of his execution that, "And yet this act whereof I die was not altogether of me, as it is thought, but I was procured and induced thereunto by others. I was, I say, induced thereunto by others, howbeit God forbid that I should name any man unto you. I will name no man unto you, and therefore I beseech you not look for it. And one thing more, good people, I have to say unto you, and that is to warn you and exhort you to beware of these seditious preachers and teachers of new doctrine, which pretend to preach God's word, but in very deed they preach their own fancies. They know not today what they would have tomorrow. They open the book, but they cannot shut it again. I could, good people, rehearse much more, but you know I have another thing to do, whereunto I must prepare me, for the time draweth away." And after he had thus spoken, he kneeled down, and, bowing towards the block, he said, "I have deserved 1,000 deaths," and thereupon he made a cross upon the straw, and kissed it, and laid his head upon the block, and so died. The executioner took his head clean off with the axe, and following this, Dudley's remains were taken into the Tower of London, and he was buried inside the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. But during the reign of Queen Victoria, the church underwent a significant amount of repairs. When Victoria visited the tower, she deemed the chapel to have been not good enough to house the remains of 3 queens, because of the state of decay and disrepair it was in. The floor was uneven and broken in places, and the renovation work was to take place, but to carry out the sufficient repair work, the Tower of London's chapel floor was removed, and when this was carried out, a number of significant remains were found. The body of Henry VIII's second wife, Anne Boleyn, was found, and it was known that Northumberland's remains were nearby, and a committee was then gathered to search for these and identify them. It was known that Queen Anne Boleyn's remains were buried close to the remains of 2 men, and it was said that 2 dukes were buried between 2 queens. The body of one man was found, and it belonged to a tall and broad man of around 50 years of age, and the committee concluded that this man who lost his head by sharp axe or weapon was Edward Seymour, the rival of John Dudley. But next to this, the body of another man was found, and these remains, it was said, belonged to a large man about 6 feet in height and aged around 50 years, and in particular it was noted that this man had a rather large skull. The committee then came to the conclusion that these remains were those belonging to John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland. His body and skeletal remains were then collected and were placed inside a new lead coffin and container. The name of Dudley was etched onto this, and months after his remains were exhumed, they were then reburied inside the Tower's chapel. John Dudley was the Duke of Northumberland, who is remembered as being a schemer and a manipulator, who took control of England whilst Edward VI was just a young boy. He was supposed to be helping to rule, but he made a number of significant changes to the nation. Dudley, however, was someone who flew too close to the sun, and his involvement in placing his daughter-in-law as the Queen of England led to his downfall, one that would result in the loss of his head in front of a crowd of 10,000, as an axeman performed the job of his execution. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.